The alien queen sat upon her throne of crystal and flame, the crown of her ancestors glowing faintly above her brow, her eyes sharp as blades, her voice strong enough to silence armies, yet all the power of her empire could not hush the cries of the infant in her arms. The sound tore through the grand hall, louder than the rumble of engines, louder than the storm winds of 1,000 planets. The delegates who gathered at her court shifted uneasily, whispering behind jeweled masks, while the queen clenched her jaw and held the child close. The palace was vast, a fortress of light and shadow carved from stone that had drifted through galaxies before being bound together by her ancestors. It had withstood sieges and invasions. It had bent the will of those who thought themselves unconquerable. Yet tonight the walls echoed with a sound that no blade, no fleet, no weapon could quell. The cries of her heir, the only blood of her blood. The queen summoned caretakers from across the stars. Healers, singers, warriors turned gentle by retirement. She demanded answers, and they gave them freely in trembling voices, each one promising that their method, their secret, their tradition would calm the child. Yet none succeeded. The wails grew louder, rattling the golden chandeliers and shaking the mosaics that told the stories of her victory. The queen shifted restlessly, her pride clashing with her exhaustion. She was ruler of countless systems, yet here she sat, powerless against the storm. In her arms her people whispered that perhaps the child was cursed. Others whispered that the queen herself was cursed, for in her rise to power she had been ruthless, she had broken treaties, she had torn crowns from rivals and bent them to her will. Now, those whispers painted her as a mother unfit for mercy. Still, she refused to yield. She dismissed the first nanny, then another and another. Each failure stoked the fire of her temper, until the palace itself trembled with her rage. 15 nannies had come and gone within 2 months, their faces pale, their hands shaking, their eyes haunted by the memory of sleepless nights and endless screams. The infant heir remained restless, tiny hands clutching at the air, searching for something unseen. The queen tried every method she had been advised. She sang ancient songs of her people, her voice once able to move legions, now quivering with fatigue. She wrapped the child in silks, soft enough to comfort gods. She even lowered her head in solitude, whispering pleas that no one would ever hear. Still the cries went on, piercing the silence of the night. The council avoided her gaze. The palace guards stood stiff as statues, unwilling to betray their pity. The servants moved quickly through corridors, careful to keep their eyes lowered. The queen felt the weight of her crown heavier than ever, not from its gold but from the judgment that followed her every step. She held the child closer, her hands trembling, her heart furious with itself, and for the first time in her reign she wondered if all her power was nothing before the simple truth that no empire could soothe a child who longed not for wealth or command but for warmth. The first nanny arrived, draped in silks, spun from the clouds of a distant gas world. Her voice carried the tone of winds that once lulled her people to sleep across endless skies. She promised the queen that her songs could tame any storm. Her hands moved gently, her feathers glowing with the soft shimmer. Yet when she cradled the infant and sang her melodies, the cries grew louder, echoing through the grand hall, until the nanny trembled with shame and fled from the chamber. The second nanny was a healer from a frozen moon, her body carved of ice, her heart steady as stone. She brought with her the knowledge of ancient remedies, powders and herbs that had soothed generations. She mixed them with precision and whispered blessings over the child, yet the infant wailed and thrashed, spilling every potion to the floor. And when the queen's gaze grew sharp, the healer bowed low and departed in silence. The third nanny was a warrior who had laid down her blade and vowed to care for the weak. She had once commanded armies, her armor still polished, though her sword hung unused upon her back. She held the infant with arms that had never trembled in battle, and promised the queen that discipline and strength would bring calm. But her stern methods only drew sharper cries. The warrior stood frozen for the first time in her life, broken not by war but by the voice of a child she left, her armor clattering as she fled. And so it continued. Each nanny brought into the palace carried hope into the chamber, only to walk out with despair. One sang lullabies in tongues that made planets bloom. One danced with such grace the very walls seemed to sway. One used lights and colors to enchant the senses. One wrapped the child in threads that glowed with warmth, yet none found success. The cries never ceased. The palace halls remained filled with the sound of grief and frustration. The queen grew restless. Her voice rang out in fury at every failure, her eyes cold as she dismissed one nanny after another. Her patience cracked, her heart weary. Though she would never allow the council to see her weakness, still, she sat each night, holding her heir, feeling the weight of solitude heavy upon her shoulders. Whispers spread through the palace. The servants exchanged fearful glances in the corridors. The guards avoided the nursery as if the cries themselves carried a curse. Some said the child bore the rage of fallen kings. Some said the queen had ruled with such fire that her heir was doomed to burn with it. Others dared to whisper that perhaps the queen was simply incapable of love. By the end of 2 months, 15 nannies had been dismissed, their names forgotten, their faces lost to the silence of corridors that swallowed failure. The queen stood alone in her throne room, her arms aching, her crown slipping, as she looked upon the restless child and wondered if the galaxy itself conspired to remind her that not even a ruler of worlds could command the heart of her own blood. The palace had grown used to war councils and grand feasts, yet now its corridors echoed only with cries that no wall could contain. Every attempt to mask the sound failed. Every banquet was disturbed. Every chamber shook with the restless voice of the air, and the court grew restless. The whispers of servants spread like shadows, slipping under doors and curling around every jeweled pillar. They spoke of curses and omens. They spoke of vengeance from rival dynasties. They spoke of divine punishment cast upon the queen for her merciless rise to power. Once she had crushed rulers who begged for mercy. Once she had burned treaties and banished whole houses from the council. Now some murmured that the tears of her child were the cries of justice ringing through the palace halls. The queen heard the whispers. She always heard them, though none dared speak them aloud. Before her throne her fury burned brighter than her pride, but fury could not change the truth. Her arms were heavy, her eyes hollow, her strength was fraying. She could march to war against fleets and stand unbroken, yet each night she found herself trembling, unable to soothe her child. The weight of her empire felt lighter than the weight of her heir. The counselors avoided her gaze. They offered counsel on trade and defense. They spoke of treaties and borders, yet their words faltered as the sound of crying filled the chamber, their polished voices drowned by a small voice too young to understand crowns or empires. Each council meeting ended in silence, a silence filled with pity and fear. The servants grew wary of walking near the nursery. They crossed themselves in alien gestures of protection. Some claimed to hear whispers within the cries, voices of ghosts long forgotten. Some swore that the chandeliers swayed with each wail, as though even stone and steel bent under its force. Others said the cries stirred their own memories of loneliness and loss, and they left the chamber weeping through it all. The queen held firm, her face carved from steel, her voice cold and sharp. But in the stillness of night, when no one was near, she lowered her head over the child and let her breath shake, her shoulders heavy with grief. She wondered if she was meant to be both queen and mother, or if the stars demanded she could only be Anand. Yet somewhere in the vast palace, a man walked unnoticed. He wore no crown, no jewels, only the uniform of service, his hands red from soap, his back bent from long labor. He was a human janitor, sweeping corridors and polishing windows while empires rose and fell above his head. He was not part of the council, nor the whispers. He was simply a father, raising a young daughter alone within the shadow of the palace walls. Though no one looked twice at him, he looked often at the queen from afar. He watched how her hands shook when she thought no one was watching. He noticed how the child clutched desperately at the air, as though searching not for songs or science, but for something far simpler, something the galaxy's greatest ruler had never been taught. The human janitor moved quietly through the vast halls of the palace, each step measured, each motion careful, as though the slightest sound might shatter something fragile in the air. He pushed his mop across the polished floors, the rhythm steady and familiar, yet his eyes never left the nursery corridor. The soft glow of crystal light reflected off his worn shoes. The corridors seemed endless, yet he knew the paths by heart, every corner, every archway, every whispering shadow of the palace. Wolsey had watched the queen from a distance for weeks. She moved through her empire like a comet of authority, sharp and blinding, her crown gleaming, her robes flowing. Yet he saw the cracks behind the fire, the exhaustion behind the regality, the way her shoulders sagged when no one else could see. And most of all, he saw the child who cried, not out of mischief but out of need, a small human reaction to a galaxy too vast for any infant to comprehend. The servants avoided the nursery. They whispered behind the janitor's back about the impossible demands of the queen. They spoke of the 15th nanny sent away last night, pale and trembling. The palace seemed to lean toward despair. Even the guards looked tense, their hands gripping spear shafts tighter than needed. Yet the janitor continued to sweep quietly, passing unnoticed. He was a shadow among shadows, yet his gaze remained fixed to one The evening when the final nanny stormed out of the chamber, her feathers ruffled her robes, torn from frantic movement, the queen stood alone, trembling, her crown slipping from her brow, her small heir wriggling in her arms, too young to understand the fury surrounding them. The janitor paused outside the open door, heart steady but mind alert. He could see the queen faltering. She was human behind the alien features. Her hands shook, her lips pressed tight. She had no idea how fragile she appeared. He stepped forward softly, his mop left, resting against the wall, the crystal tiles reflecting his presence. Like scattered stars, he did not bow, he did not speak loudly, he simply extended his hand and offered a gentle smile, a human gesture of calm, a patience forged through nights of rocking his own daughter to sleep when the world had been cruel and unrelenting. The queen looked at him, startled, her instincts screamed for command, for dismissal, yet something in the tilt of his head, the way his eyes held understanding without judgment, made her hesitate. The child in her arms reached toward him, small fingers curling around the space between them, a connection unspoken yet immediate, and the queen felt her chest tighten. She realized she had never seen such stillness in the halls of her palace, a stillness not born of fear but of certainty. Janitor knelt, slowly lowering himself to be nearer the child, his voice barely a whisper, a lullaby half remembered from earth, soft as a sigh yet strong enough to catch the attention of the infant. The cries stilled, a tremor ran through the palace. Even the walls seemed to lean closer to witness the unexpected miracle. The queen's arms loosened slightly, the tension in her shoulders fading. Though her pride remained wary, for the first time in many nights, the palace felt suspended, not in anger, not in fear, but in fragile possibility, a silence that spoke louder than any command, a promise that perhaps even the impossible could change. The palace seemed to hold its breath as the janitor remained kneeling before the queen, and her infant, the child's tiny hands gripped his fingers, and for a moment the wailing that had haunted the halls for months vanished like mist in sunlight. The crystal pillars glimmered softly, reflecting the stillness that had settled over the throne room. The queen's eyes widened. She had seen nothing like this. No nanny, no healer, no singer or warrior had ever been able to achieve such calm, and the realization struck her hard that this simple human carried something the palace had never known. He hummed a melody faint and steady, a lullaby born of late nights and weary days, a rhythm meant not to command but to soothe the soul. The child's eyes fluttered shut, the tiny breaths evened out, and the queen felt her grip relax for the first time in weeks. Her shoulders sagged and a shiver ran down her spine. She had always believed that authority and power were the only tools a ruler needed. Yet here, in the presence of patience and quiet understanding, she began to see the limits of crowns and crowns alone. The counselors remained behind the glass walls of the observation chamber, whispering among themselves, their voices a low murmur of astonishment and disbelief. The guards stared, slack-jawed, their hands loosening on the hilts of their weapons. The servants paused mid-step, some clutching dusters, some holding trays, frozen as though the palace itself had paused to witness a miracle in motion. The queen shifted slightly, her gaze never leaving the janitor and the child. The crown upon her brow seemed heavier than ever, yet lighter somehow, as though the weight of expectation was being shared across the air. The infant yawned, stretching tiny arms, and then curled closer to the janitor, who held him with care that spoke of experience born of necessity, not ceremony. The palace echoed not with cries, but with a gentle hush that pressed softly against every surface. She realized suddenly that she had been trying to command what could not be commanded. She had sought obedience and skill from those who had never held a human infant in the quiet of night. She had demanded perfection from strangers who could never know the subtleties of fear and comfort. And yet here was a man who had faced nights filled with tears that were all his own, and had learned how to answer without judgment or fury. The janitor looked up at her only briefly, his smile faint, his hand steady. He did not boast or demand recognition. He did not speak of the failures of the nannies or the impossibility of the task. He simply returned his attention to the child, rocking slightly, humming softly, a rhythm that resonated through the hall and into the queen's heart. The walls of the palace seemed to exhale a breath that had been held too long. The chandeliers glimmered faintly, the crystal floors reflected light that shimmered like distant stars. The queen felt warmth creep through her chest, a sensation she had almost forgotten under the weight of rule and expectation. She realized that perhaps the palace could change, perhaps it could hold laughter and comfort alongside power and command. In that moment, a fragile bond was formed, a quiet partnership that no one had anticipated. A human janitor, a single father in a palace of stars, and a queen who ruled galaxies, yet found herself learning the most difficult lesson of all, patience, love, and the quiet strength that comes from care alone. The days that followed the janitor's first gentle intervention passed in a rhythm entirely new to the palace. The child slept in longer stretches, the cries that had filled the corridors became whispers that floated softly through the halls, and the queen felt her mind and body uncoil from the constant tension she had carried for months. She observed the janitor closely, noting how he moved with quiet confidence, how he adjusted the blankets without fuss, how he hummed to the child without a hint of self-importance. The palace itself seemed to sense the change. The crystal pillars that had once cast harsh reflections now glimmered softly. The light from the chandeliers danced across the marble floors in gentle patterns. Even the guards felt a shift in the air, their shoulders relaxing, though none dared speak aloud of the miracle unfolding before them. The servants moved with a lighter step, their whispers turning from worry to curiosity. The atmosphere was subtly altered by a presence that demanded no command, yet carried authority of a kind the queen had never understood. She found herself drawn into the process. She observed the child's reactions, noting which gestures soothed, which motions caused distress. She attempted to mimic the janitor's techniques, the way he cradled the infant, how he maintained eye contact without overwhelming, how he let the child set the rhythm of attention and care. She found herself laughing softly when the child cooed or reached for a toy, a sound she had not allowed herself to make in months, a sound that filled the hall with warmth instead of tension. The janitor never demanded recognition. He never boasted of the failures of the past nannies. He simply continued his quiet work, moving through the palace with the same humility and patience that had marked him from the beginning. He engaged with the queen only when necessary, offering suggestions in a tone soft enough to avoid bruising her pride, yet firm enough to guide her through moments of doubt. He became a teacher without arrogance, a presence that transformed not just the child, but the adult ruler who had carried worlds on her shoulders. The queen began to understand that power alone could not shape the palace, nor nurture the heir. It was care, patience, observation, and love that bridged the gap between authority and humanity. She realized that she had been trying to command a response where none could be commanded, that no crown could replace the steady consistency the janitor brought with him each day. She marveled at the simplicity and effectiveness of his methods and found herself relying on him more than she had imagined possible. Even the council noticed the subtle transformation. They whispered among themselves at the end of meetings that the palace seemed less tense, that the queen's gaze was softer, that laughter could now be heard echoing faintly through the corridors. The empire had seen wars won and treaties broken, yet none of it had changed the queen as profoundly as the simple presence of a human father who mopped floors and held a child with steady hands and quiet certainty. And beyond. So the palace shifted its rhythm. The halls once dominated by fear now hummed with the promise of care. The crystal floors gleamed with a softer glow, and the queen learned that ruling a galaxy was not enough to rule a home. It required patience, love, and the gentle hand of someone who understood the small yet infinite needs of a child. The palace had begun to breathe differently. The halls no longer vibrated with tension, but with a gentle rhythm that carried through the crystal pillars and reflected softly off the polished marble floors. The child now responded to the janitor with smiles and coos, small arms reaching for his steady hands, and the queen watched in wonder as the impossible transformation unfolded before her eyes. She realized that no throne, no crown, no display of power could command what patience and quiet attention could achieve. The janitor moved through the nursery with careful precision, yet without hurry. He knew the child's moods better than anyone else. He anticipated the tiny frowns and adjusted the blankets before the infant could even fuss. He hummed softly, rocking the small body in a rhythm that seemed to resonate with the very heartbeat of the palace. The queen followed from a short distance, studying his technique, each small gesture a lesson in understanding and care. She noticed the way he spoke gently, not to command, but to guide the child's attention, how he let the infant lead their interactions without imposing his will. The queen found herself participating more each day. She adjusted her own hands to mimic his gentle touch. She hummed quietly alongside him. The child responded instantly, cooing, reaching toward her with trust, forming in a bond she had never imagined possible. She realized that she had been approaching motherhood as if it were a battle to be won. She had relied on authority and discipline, yet what was required was something entirely different, a balance of patience, observation, and emotional presence. The Council members whispered among themselves at the edges of the halls, some amazed, others skeptical, yet they could not deny the change they saw. The palace no longer carried the oppressive weight of constant crying and frustration. The crystal chandeliers reflected light differently now, the colors softer, warmer. The guards noticed it. To their postures, eased, their movements more fluid, as though the palace itself had learned to exhale. The servants moved with newfound confidence, less fearful of reprimand, more willing to smile and interact with one another, as though the presence of the janitor had altered the very atmosphere. The queen began to feel an unexpected warmth within herself. She laughed quietly. When the child reached for a dangling toy, she marveled at the small gestures of recognition that had previously gone unnoticed. She realized that ruling a galaxy had prepared her for strategy and command, but it had not prepared her for these intimate moments of care. And yet, with the janitor guiding her, she began to understand the subtleties. She had been blind to. The infant began to respond with certainty, reaching out not only to the janitor, but to the queen as well, tiny hands grasping for both their fingers. A small sigh of contentment escaping the lips, the queen felt her heart swell, a strange new pride, not the pride of conquest, but the pride of nurturing something precious and fragile into comfort and trust. The janitor's influence spread quietly through the palace, even beyond the nursery. The atmosphere shifted. The palace became a place where patience and care were valued alongside strength and authority. The queen realized that she had not only learned to calm her child, she had begun to learn the true measure of her own strength. The palace had become a place of gentle rhythm. The halls no longer echoed with cries but with laughter and soft footsteps. The infant now cooed and babbled, reaching out for the janitor's steady hands and the queen's careful fingers. The crystal pillars reflected light in warm patterns that danced across the marble floors, as though the building itself celebrated the quiet transformation. The council and servants alike moved through corridors with a newfound ease, their whispers no longer filled with worry but with astonishment at the subtle miracle they witnessed each day. The queen observed from her throne, not in command but in wonder. She watched as the janitor guided the child with patience born of experience and necessity. He did not act as a teacher or a master. He moved as a parent who understood instinctively when to intervene, when to let the child lead, and when to offer calm reassurance. The queen mirrored his motions hesitantly at first, then with growing confidence, humming alongside him, rocking the infant gently, responding to the cues of need and comfort she had never learned through books or degrees. The council began to approach cautiously to observe the technique. The servants dared to step closer to see the infant smiling and gurgling in response to a human hand. The guards lingered near the nursery doors, their stiff postures easing as if the calm in the room flowed outward, infecting the palace itself. Even the chandeliers seemed to shimmer with a softer brilliance, reflecting the new harmony of the environment. The air no longer felt tense and suffocating but alive with a quiet energy that spoke of safety and care. The queen felt a shift within herself. She realized that true authority required more than command. It required observation, patience, and the willingness to meet vulnerability with understanding. The janitor had taught her without words the power of consistency, the importance of presence, the subtle language of touch and rhythm, and she felt her pride soften, replaced by a quiet admiration and trust. The infant reached out equally to her and to the janitor, forming a bond that was neither forced nor commanded but entirely mutual and natural. The janitor never claimed recognition. He moved without expectation, yet the results spoke louder than any words. Could the child thrived and flourished, the palace thrummed with new life, and the queen began to understand that leadership was not always about ruling with fire, but sometimes about nurturing with patience. Even a ruler of galaxies could learn this lesson, and she did not shrink from it. The first public moment of acknowledgement came during a council meeting when the queen carried the infant to the center of the hall. The janitor stood nearby, watching quietly. He did not bow, he did not demand anything. He simply allowed his work to speak for itself. The queen looked across the assembly and spoke of the transformation that had occurred, of the patience and care that had brought her child peace. She praised the human who had mopped the floors, yet taught a palace the meaning of calm. The delegates murmured in surprise, admiration, and respect, and as the infant cooed, reaching up toward the queen and the janitor, the palace seemed to exhale collectively. The crystal floors glimmered, the pillars shimmered, the hall vibrated with quiet joy, and the queen understood fully that the janitor had changed not only her child's life, but the life of the palace forever, transforming it into a home filled with love and attention, not fear and frustration. The palace had become a place of gentle order, a place where the crystal pillars no longer reflected tension but warmth and soft Light the halls echoed with laughter and the small coos of the infant reaching for both the queen and the janitor. As though the child had learned that comfort could come from anyone who offered patience and care, the council observed in awe. The guards walked with lighter steps, the servants moved freely, smiling quietly among themselves, and even the chandeliers seemed to shimmer more brightly as though the building itself celebrated the change. The queen stood near the throne, no longer rigid with exhaustion but calm. With a new understanding, she watched the janitor kneel beside the crib, rocking the infant, humming softly, his hands steady, his movements precise yet gentle. Each motion carried a quiet authority born of experience and love. She saw how the child's eyes lit up, how small hands clutched at his fingers without fear or hesitation, and she realized that she had learned a lesson far greater than any from the scrolls of her ancestors or the counsels of her advisors. She approached the janitor, slowly kneeling beside him, her fingers brushing against his, in an acknowledgement without words, a silent gesture of gratitude and trust. The child reached toward her, and then toward him. The three of them formed a small circle of connection, a triangle of care that radiated outward into the palace halls. The council whispered quietly, some still, in disbelief at how a single human father had transformed the atmosphere of a palace that had ruled stars and planets for generations. The queen's voice broke the murmurs. She spoke softly yet with authority about the change she had witnessed. She told the council that power alone could never nurture a child, that patience and presence were as vital as any command, that the janitor's methods had brought peace to the infant and harmony to the palace, and that his quiet strength had taught her more about leadership than any decree or battle she had won. She praised him not as a servant but as a teacher, a guide, and a partner in raising the heir of her empire. The janitor remained humble, his gaze never leaving the infant. He did not seek glory or title. He simply continued his work, letting actions speak louder than words. He fed the child, he played with the child, he soothed the child, and with every motion he demonstrated the truth of care that no throne could ever grant by itself. The palace seemed to hum around them, alive with the rhythm of nurture and trust. The air was lighter, the halls felt wide and welcoming. The laughter of the child echoed like music through the corridors. Once dark with tension, the queen took her place beside him in the nursery, no longer distant from the small moments of life she had once overlooked. She learned to anticipate the child's needs. She learned to smile at the soft movements and quiet gestures. She learned to laugh and coo and rock with patience, not command. The palace became not only a center of governance, but a home, a place where love and authority coexisted, a place where the smallest gestures carried as much weight as the mightiest edicts. And so the palace changed forever. A human single father who mopped floors had altered the life of a queen, her child, and the very rhythm of a galaxy-spanning home. The halls carried laughter and calm, where once they carried only cries and tension. The queen had learned humility, the council had learned respect, and the child had learned that the warmth of care was more powerful than any crown.